This is a screen replacement tutorial using Composite Brush for After Effects. In this tutorial, the steps are tracking in Mocha, stabilizing in After Effects, painting out tracking markers, placing the logo, keying the fingers, toolkit prepping the asset so any color background works with the finger, and adding motion blur to the appropriate layers. Here's the shot we'll be working with, and wasting no time, let's jump right into Mocha. This isn't a Mocha tutorial, but I would recommend looking up Mary Poplin. She's the official instructor for Mocha, and I learned from her tutorials. There's a new feature in Mocha as of After Effects 2019. Expand the planar surface of selected layer to fill the entire frame. And I'm going to click this, and now the planar surface is here, framing up the whole shot. And what this does is basically it keeps the entire shot stabilized. Some may argue it's more advantageous to frame up the phone as tightly as you can to use less pixels when you're compositing, but stabilizing the whole shot is more easily understandable. Back on my Mocha effect, I'll go to Tracking Data and press Create Track Data. Turn on this layer, press OK. Now I have this layer selected, and with Mocha Import Plus, I'm going to press Load. Then I'm going to duplicate this layer, make sure I have Stabilize Precomp selected, and press Apply. Moving into the Stabilize Precomp, the first thing I'm going to do is paint out these tracking markers. Because this is stabilized, this is very easy. I'll use my Clone Stamp tool, and then from the first frame, my duration is set to constant. And I'm going to paint over each of these markers. See how this looks so far. Mostly pretty good. The only one that's going to be a pain is this last one. So instead of duration constant, I'll set it to custom. I'll make this 10 frames or so, just enough so I have a handle I can grab onto when I create it. Then I'll paint the stroke. And I'm going to scrub along. And this is the last frame where it's valid, so I'm going to take this and move this back to here. That's a little gross there, I'll fix that in a second. I'll clean from here forward. Stretch this out. And then I'll do single frame cleanup here. That's not too perfect, but it doesn't really have to be. And then on this frame here, I'm erasing a little of the finger. You would never see in a million years, but we might as well just touch the erase tool. And you can go to duration single frame, erase paint only, and touch up that edge. Missed a spot. There. So you can see how very easy it was to paint out the tracking markers on this phone because the composition was stabilized. I didn't do the greatest job possible with some of these reflections here, so you'll notice that you can pretty clearly see the clone stamp in here. And if you wanted to, you could try to do a better job going through here frame by frame. But I'm not going to bother because once you have a screen texture on there, you probably won't see that anyway. And I don't want this tutorial to take forever. I'll close out of my layer window, grab my selector, and now this footage I would refer to as my clean layer. I'm going to pre-compose this, moving all the attributes into the comp because this paint work is done and I don't want any of my other effects to conflict with it. And I'll just call this clean. Next up, we need to work in a screen. So I'm going to press Ctrl Y, Command Y on Mac, and I'll draw one in there. That's close enough, and then I'm going to turn this on. So again, I don't have to do anything to track this on. If I tab back, then this pre-comp is stabilized, so this is already attached. So again, everything we do is going to happen in the stabilized pre-comp, and then it's just going to work when we come back out to the full shot. So I'll toss our logo into there. Absolutely beautiful. And I'll set this to alpha matte underneath the screen matte. Now you may be wondering, which transfer mode is best for screens? Well, the answer is screen. And if you take a look here, screen as opposed to normal is going to let you see the reflection of the finger. So I had my opacity down, but normal just looks very fake. Screen looks a lot more realistic. This could use some color correction to blend a little bit better, but let's get to the keying first. So I have my clean layer, and actually, because I've already gone through the effort of painting out the markers and making sure that there's no seam between where the markers and the fingers touch, I'm going to pull my key right off of this. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, place it over the top, and I'm going to use Composite brush. Now I'm going to warn you, the key is going to be tremendously anticlimactic. So if I just go here and just use whatever, the medium preset, I think I have to set this to Silhouette Alpha. I'll click and drag on the finger to designate those areas as opaque, and then I'll alt-click and drag on the colors around the finger to designate those as transparent. And it's done. So why does this work so well? Well, basically, whenever you shoot a phone, this is a black background, and we're putting in a dark background. And because of that, this edge is a little bit dark because, the finger was blended with a dark background, and the whole composite just works. Even here where there's motion blur, this feels dark, this doesn't feel like a problem. But this tutorial would be no fun if it was too easy. So let's just say that we had planned on shooting on a dark background and shooting with a dark element, but then the client changed their mind, and suddenly the screen going in there is pure white. Now we have a problem because this doesn't blend at all. This is a very common problem in compositing. You get a dark edge around your finger where it's blending from the motion blur, where the finger is pinkish and the screen is black. So in the middle is a dark pink, and it's very noticeable. So let's remove Composite brush and start this from scratch with the understanding that we're going to be doing a worst case scenario, light screen being composite into a phone that was shot black. So here are some different examples of ways you can shoot phone screens. Green is fairly common. White works when you're going to substitute in a very bright image. And black is also pretty common. Black is actually my favorite way to do it because there are some compositing issues that go with that. But ultimately, black preserves the reflections, like this reflection in the finger right here, and is going to make for the most realistic composite if you put in the time to get it right. So the first thing we should be worried about is getting the blend between this finger and the black screen and making this area look nice. We have this hair key preset, which is really good for, any sort of semi-transparent material. Motion blur counts in that category. So let's click on a dark part of the phone screen and then alt-click somewhere on the finger, preferably at the end of this motion blur. So if I just kind of zoom in, right about there. That's looking okay. I'm going to solo this and pop into the alpha channel. Let's bring down the matte high level. In this case, we actually don't want to preserve this reflection. Let's just crop that out entirely and go down until we're just about to start to eat into that finger, but then no further. The reason why we don't want that reflection is that we have this background here, and we're going to be screening over this screen here, this pure white. And between the two of these, you're already getting the reflection, and really what you just have to do is put the finger over the top. So soloing the finger, we have to fix this dark edge. If you go to Effect, Channel, Remove Color Matting, it basically does just that. So shut off both of your effects for a second, and try to choose the exact color that you had keyed out. It actually does a pretty great job. You can fudge this a little bit to see if you can change your results. So maybe make it a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. I think that's working just fine. Let's play through that. And yep, right there, that's what dreams are made of. When the contamination from the motion blur is completely gone, using Remove Color Matting. Here's our real world example. If you take a look, if you just composited it without the Remove Color Matting effect, then yeah, you can get away with it on blue. But if you're doing a toolkit for an agency or a news network where this asset will have to be composited over multiple color backgrounds, it's going to work here when remove color matting is on, but down here you're going to see that dark edge and it's going to look terrible and someone's going to have to recomp it every single time you change that background. So that's why I stress it's so important to decontaminate your compositing elements. So this is the key that we want to use to get this finger that's affected by the motion blur. But what about these fingers that aren't affected by the motion blur? And don't worry, we'll be coming back to this being semi-transparent in a second. Well, we have this set holdout preset, so I'll click that. I'm going to use hard mode because I know this is going to be a very easy key and hard processes a bit faster than medium. I'm just going to click and drag here. And then Alt click and drag over the screen. We'll treat the thumb and the index finger separately. So we'll get remove color matting off of the thumb, and maybe we'll use different effects on it. And we'll get this holdout mat to stop affecting the index finger. So let's create a compositing mat. So first, let's designate an area for remove color matting. So I'm just going to do a loose shape around this finger. Just double checking that. And again, because this is stabilized, this is really easy to do. And I'm going to do another shape around these other fingers. I should name them. So then when I press E, I'm going to go to remove color matting, hit the plus button, and I'm going to say that I want that to only happen inside the index mask, which is yellow. And then this is our hand holdout. I'll press E. In the compositing options, I'll say I only want this to take place inside the hand mask. Okay, that's looking good. And by the way, if I didn't mention before, this set holdout preset, all this does is it restores the original colors of the shot and the original alpha channel. So this overrides any changes you made previously. So just for example, I'll go to color correction, hue and saturation, make this like green or something crazy. This is looking back at the source of the shot, which is here, and compositing that over the top, regardless of what effects come before it. Let's just get rid of that. This could use just the smallest choke and the smallest blur, but choke the other way. All right. So now we need a holdout on this finger. To make this holdout matte, it might be easier to use a separate layer. So I'll duplicate over this clean layer again. And I'm going to apply a new instance of composite brush. I'll click and drag over the finger I want to select. Then Alt click and drag around it on the screen. And set my transfer mode to silhouette alpha. We want just the index finger, so let's make a mask for that. And let's play it. So we can choke this a bit. We don't want to remove too much of the dark edge, because the finger does have a contour which is shaded, and there is going to be a slight shadow against the screen, so some of it's okay. And we'll add a slight blur. And for the most part that looks pretty good, except there are a handful of frames where it doesn't. This is the most glaring frame, and probably the easiest way to approach this is to avoid choke and blur, and to just mask out these dark edges. I'll set the mask to subtract. Set a keyframe for its path, and then feather the mask. Even though the mask UI visibility is toggled off, as long as I have the mask selected, I can hit Ctrl-Shift-H to hide the mask, and then use the arrow keys to move it around. So that looks pretty good. Let's go to the next frame. It's fine, the finger is out. Let's go to the previous frame. On this frame, we're losing a lot of detail, so let's bring it up here, maybe cut off a tiny bit of the top. But let's just pull this over a little bit. Looks okay. This all looks fine. Just gonna leave that there. Moving back a frame. Choke out a little bit more where we see that motion blur. Alright, I think that will do it. I'll go through and set my choke and blur keyframes. There might be a few frames where I can use a little bit more. Like here. Gonna set my keys here where they look good. And on this frame where they look good. And then here, I'll just choke this in a little more. And blur that out a little more. Alright, that looks pretty good. One thing to keep in mind is we only have to be compositing within the bounds of this screen, because there's no point in changing any of the details outside of where the screen is being composited, because those are all naturally captured in camera. So let's take this screen mat here, and we'll duplicate this over. And for the index finger layer, we'll set it to alpha matte, and then duplicate this screen mat again, and also set it to alpha matte. Okay, that's looking good. So those are the general steps, and that's most of the important part of the tutorial. Now I'm going to go into a little more advanced stuff that might be a little bit tedious, so stick around if you'd like. Take a look at the shot stabilized. You're going to notice there's a lot of motion blur built into the plate. And where it becomes really obvious is here. If you take a look at this thumb, see how the edge of this thumb is expanding and contracting a little bit. That's actually the motion blur because the hand and the camera were both moving a lot. This will cause some issues in the composite. You'll notice here it almost looks like that shifting edge is flickering a little bit. Just to put this in perspective, these are details you would probably never see when the shot was put back into motion. Yeah, it's pretty subtle. You probably only see this because the comp is stabilized, and because we have a textureless screen. But there is a way to fix this. And the way to do that is to get motion blur on this screen and on the mask for the finger. So how do you do that? Well, if I take this whole layer here, this is basically the whole composite. Power pin does respect motion blur, so I'll turn on the motion blur switch. And this is problematic because it's actually doubling up on the motion blur on the shot. See here? See, now this thumb is pretty blurry, but if you look back at the original footage, it wasn't quite as blurry if we A/B this. And that's because this entire comp is being motion blurred, and that's not a good thing. We only want this screen here to be motion blurred, and none of the other elements. So how do we do that? Okay, time traveling forward a little bit into the project. What we have to do is break out the stabilized pre-comp into separate layers, and some of them will have motion blur and some of them won't. So the background plate, this doesn't have motion blur added because it's already shot in the footage. Next, the cleanup also won't have motion blur added. You can see there's no motion blur switch down there. Next, we have this screen here, and that will have motion blur added. And just to really clarify what's going on here, let me go into this comp. This is the stabilized comp we had before, except it has just this screen soloed. So if I were to take this clean layer and put this back on, this is where we've been working the entire time, just so this doesn't look so foreign to you. And then next up, we would have the fingers layer. Again, this also wouldn't have a motion blur switch added to it. And then we have the same layer with motion blur applying as a mask. That way it takes care of some of that jitter we were talking about. Once the screen and once the finger masks are moving with motion blur, it essentially counterbalances and cancels out that jitter. If you right click on the finger layer, via layer source and project, the easiest way to do this is just duplicate this layer 3 times. One of these is going to represent your cleanup. We'll call this cleanup, no motion blur. Fingers, no motion blur. Screen, motion blur. And now we'll duplicate this layer over 3 times, the stabilized pre-comp, and replace with the comps above. Just to really clarify, this comp here, screen, is the same exact comp as this comp here, fingers, which is the same exact comp as this here, cleanup. In each of these comps, we're going to solo the element that we want to isolate. So in cleanup, we'll solo clean, in screen, we'll solo the screen, and in fingers, we'll solo the fingers. Cleanup is on the bottom. We'll alt click and drag to replace this bottom layer here. Set the motion blur switch to off. The screen comp will be here. That will have motion blur. The fingers comp is already here. No motion blur. So now these comps are all separate. So we'll go into this cleanup comp, solo the cleanup. And now let's take a look at our background layer plus our cleanup layer. This is correct. And then we have our screen layer. Let's solo just the screen. And this has motion blur. So if we zoom in here, you'll see some pretty distinct motion blur, which will help interact with the blurred fingers, which is good. Now this has to be set to screen. I'll go into the screen comp and turn the opacity back up and put the image back on so this is easier to see the motion blur in the outside comp. And you can see this is working, so let's play that through with the motion blur on. Cool. And then in the fingers comp, let's just go in here and solo the fingers. Okay, so this is looking much better. And now for the last step, we're going to take this layer, which is fingers with no motion blur. What we'll do is we'll duplicate it over and use it as a blurred mask. So just for example's sake, I'm going to make this completely white. And turn on motion blur. So now you can see that this layer as a mask is motion blurred to counteract that jitter. I'll hide this mask layer for a moment. Now on the unblurred layer, you can see where this edge is a little strange and this edge is a little strange. That's a result from the motion blur in the footage. So when I take the non-motion blurred layer and set the layer above it with motion blur as an alpha matte, it basically evens that out. So let's A/B that. Without, with, without, with. So there's your final result. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/compositebrush.